begin our evening now. Welcome. Thank you for coming to this lecture in honor of Truth and Reconciliation Day, which was on Saturday. So I'm going to pray to start in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Our Lady of Wisdom,
Pray for us.
Saint Joseph,
Pray for us.
Saint Francis of Assisi,
Pray for us.
in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, so this evening is partly brought to you by the Knights of Columbus of Ontario, who are encouraging us to have events or teaching that raises knowledge of Indigenous culture and history. So I feel that is important for us because we are on the traditional lands of the Algonquin people. I'm going to read to you from the General Secretary of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, just a little bit of his thoughts on truth and reconciliation. So this is Father Jean Bezina. He writes, in any given circumstance, achieving reconciliation may be difficult, yet we are called by Christ to live as brothers and sisters in his name, to be his ambassadors of peace, and to give witness to the transformative power of his love. Walking alongside Canada's Indigenous peoples, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, as well as each individual diocesan bishop, stands committed to the Catholic faith, with the Catholic faithful, to seeking truth, healing, justice, reconciliation, and hope. May we accept today's invitation to renew our commitment to reconciliation so that in the years to come we may live in greater harmony with Indigenous peoples. Okay, so I'm now going to pass it over to Dr. Jordan Alberg, who will introduce us.
So, Dr. Scott Masson teaches literature at Tyndale University in Toronto, where he also serves as chair of the English department. He has written widely in the areas of research interest, which are British and European Romanticism, poetics, intellectual history, literary theory, cultural apologetics, education, and hermeneutics. He is author of Romanticism, Hermeneutics, and Crisis of the Human Sciences, originally published in 2004 and reissued by Routledge as paperback in 2021. His entry on the novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is forthcoming, with Palgrave Encyclopedia of Romantic Era Women's Writings, edited by Natasha Duquette. Dr. Masson is a member of the Upper Mohawk Band. He promotes truth and reconciliation as vital aspects of his life calling. He has served for years in urban pastoral ministry in Toronto. He is a regular conference and campus speaker, as well as appearing on television and radio. He was the founding board chairman of Westminster Classical Christian Academy in Toronto, and he remains involved in advancing classical education in Canada. He is a proud husband and father of two. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm hoping to add to that resume by starting another classical school in Toronto this September 2024, Logos Academy. That's the plan. So thank you first of all for the warm welcome, and I'm delighted to be here. Some faces that I know from years past, and your students have come to Tyndale over the years and recommend you extremely well. I have rarely met such a group of well-educated and well-rooted students. They all can write, they speak well, they think clearly, and they love the things that I love, so that's always a good combination. My topic is truth and reconciliation, a Christian perspective. Truth and reconciliation are both very Christian terms, as we all recognize. The question that I have is whether truth and reconciliation in its contemporary understanding are what we mean by truth and reconciliation. Because defining our terms is going to be essential to being reconciled. We have to be in agreement on what we're talking about. And as Natasha said, Dr. Duquette, reconciliation is something that, or was it the bishop that said it, that we all earnestly desire as Christians. I want to start off with the reading, literature professor you heard, and with a famous poem by one of the Confederation poets. You probably know this from school. That's where I would have read it myself. Canadian literature in university as well. But the Onondaga Madonna, 1898, by Duncan Campbell Scott. I'm actually going to read it. It's a sonnet. She stands full-throated and with careless pose, this woman of a weird and waning race, the tragic savage lurking in her face, where all her pagan passion burns and glows. Her blood is mingled with her ancient foes, and thrills with war and wildness in her veins. Her rebel lips are dabbled with the stains of feuds and forays and her father's woes. And closer in the shawl about her breast, the latest promise of her nation's doom. Paler than she, her baby clings and lies, the primal warrior gleaming from his eyes. He sulks, and burdened with his infant gloom, he draws his heavy brows and will not rest. It's actually quite a powerful poem, and it's, I think, a good place to begin here, because what we hear from Duncan Campbell Scott, this great Confederation poet, is, I think, a portrait of the noble savage, the term we would know from Rousseau, describing the mankind in his earliest form before civilization comes along and corrupts him in Rousseau's view. So in Rousseau's view, we are by nature good, and we retain that goodness. We have a primal innocence until we are corrupted by society. And he himself believed that he was oppressed by the social norms of his day. And so he effectively presents a heretical view of human nature. Original sin is not part of our nature, it's something that comes to us. We're not sinners because we sin, or we. So I put to my students this question: are we sinners because we sin, or do we sin because we're sinners? We can say both, of course. But if you won't affirm the second, then you're at odds with the Christian Orthodox position. Because the reason that we sin is because we are sinners. It's part of our state. It's something. Because if we only affirm the first, there's a possibility that Rousseau would affirm that we, in our nature, are not sinners. It comes to us. So it's something that we acquire. And if we acquire it, we can also avoid it. And the way we would avoid it is through education. And this is the beginning of a new movement in education theory as well, from Rousseau onwards. And the idea of the noble savage is Rousseau's own term there. This view, I think, influences Duncan Campbell Scott's view of the Onondaga Madonna, and we can see something of the tragedy of this as Scott expresses it, and also something of the grandeur. There's admiration in this portrait. He calls her a Madonna as well, which with clear references that don't need to be explained. And yet there's something about this Madonna which he does not worship, and which he thinks is doomed to a tragic existence. And I'll say more about that in a second. I just wanted to start with that brief poem. We'll come back to Mr. Scott in a few minutes. Let me start by defining terms. Truth and reconciliation, I'm going to look at both. Truth. I was talking to my philosophy colleagues and saying, what should I say here? This could be a long talk if I get into this. But let's just say with this, the basic, that which is true or in accordance with fact or reality. For example, Aristotle is to say of what is, that it is, and of what it is not, that it is not, is true. That's a traditional understanding of what truth is. But there's a secondary meaning, which is more common in our day, which is a fact or belief that is accepted as true. Now, these aren't necessarily opposed to one another, not necessarily. But again, there's a distinction between the two. One is, it's true because it is in accordance with facts and reality, and the other is that it is accepted as true. So it's a social acceptance, it's a social construction of it. And the second is what I believe, and I'm going to put my cards on the table, we're largely dealing in the truth and reconciliation discussions of our day. The second notion of truth, and not the first. And that is because the climate of our day is very much marked. It was mentioned that I delve in literary theory. It's my area of expertise, for better or for worse, usually for worse. Unlike theories of race or sex, i.e. feminism, post-colonial theory is the first true emanation of postmodernism. Feminism precedes it, it antedates it. You can trace feminism to Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, arguably, maybe others. Racial discussions, they antedate postmodernism. But post-colonial literary theory is a result of postmodernism. So let me say a little bit about the tenets of postmodernism in relation to post-colonial theory. Its aim is to deconstruct the West to save the other. Now the other is the Oyondaga Madonna. She's not a rational being. She's an admirable being, and yet she's a tragic character in many ways. Tragic for reasons that I'll amplify in a second as well. But the specific purpose of this decolonization is to undo colonialism in every respect, systematically, in every respect. And that includes the way we think and talk. So let me say a little bit about post-colonial literary theory. You may have no interest, but it's pertinent to the discussion here. There are two principles to postmodernism, we can say. One is it has a knowledge principle. It rejects correspondence theories of truth like Aristotle's. It just rejects it in favor of a constructivist, a cultural constructivist theory of truth, in other words, this one. Secondly, it has a political principle. And the political principle is that the world is a construction of systems of power and privilege and access to power. And with that, it shares much in common with Marxism. But it's not an outflow of Marxism. It's more Michel Foucault. Everything is about power. Knowledge is power, says Foucault, actually. He's quoting Bacon, but nonetheless, he uses it in a very particular way, and it characterizes Foucault's thought. Foucault, by the way, the most cited scholar in the modern academy in the last 40 years. So those two principles, a knowledge principle and a political principle, and it has four basic themes, and these are all relevant here as well. First of all, the blurring of boundaries. Hence, its opposition to the first notion of truth, because that's going to draw clear boundaries between what is and what is not. That's a clear boundary. It's clear. You can logically construct it, you can defend it, you can articulate it, and it's going to fit with the three laws of logic, including the law of non-contradiction. Secondly, there's a belief in the overwhelming power of language to determine reality amongst postmodernists. They think that language is power, and that language has a power to determine reality. And therefore, because truth is socially constructed, we have to police language. We must do that because that's how we control truth. Truth is not something to be rationally determined. It's something that comes about when we speak about it, therefore you may not say certain things. So certain words become verboten as a result, right? And hence it will accuse any critics of any species of denialism. So at the moment, and I'll get into this in a bit, maybe, the residential schools, if there's any sort of nuance to the residential schools episode, the critics are accused of being denialists. Now those of us who are old enough will know the resonances are those of Nazi Germany, denying the Holocaust. And of course that's pertinent here because in Canada's Parliament, I think it was last October, the residential schools episode was actually called a genocide. Strong language. It was passed with no dissent, not one. Even though the facts don't bear that judgment. And this is the Canadian Parliament that agreed to this. or at least there were no dissenters. Thirdly, it is marked by cultural relativism. All cultures are equally valid. We can't adjudicate between them. There's no true beliefs, false beliefs, iniquitous beliefs, virtuous beliefs, no such things. All cultures are effectively variations on the same thing. 50 Shades of Grey. Fourthly, postmodernism is marked by the loss of individuality and also universality. So the individual matters not to postmodernism, and neither do universal notions like that would comport with the first definition. They also are not there. First, truth. Now reconciliation. Reconciliation, as the bishop presented it to us, is the restoration of friendly relations. We're to be at peace with all men. As far as is possible, be on good terms. Right? Reconciliation is a Christian theme, arguably the Christian theme. I will return to that at the end. But secondly, we can see reconciliation more in keeping with, again, a different, very different type of definition, the action of making one view or belief compatible with another. In finance, you can reconcile accounts. You can make them compatible with one another. Reconciling opposites. Now, in one sense, that could be the basis for this, but what's meant by this is making them say the same thing. Univocity, unanimity. Now, for a post-colonialist, the latter is the one in view. And bear in mind what I just said about the two basic principles of knowledge and power, and the four basic themes. So when Pope Francis issued his apology for the residential schools episode, he was told it was not good enough. Critics didn't really say why it wasn't really good enough, but it simply wasn't good enough. And that's because he still purported to be a Christian, I suspect. Whatever we think of the apology, it wasn't good enough. Most people were surprised. Some would find it objectionable that an apology was issued. I'm not going to comment on that per se, but just note that the response was, that's not good enough. I was surprised, but then I thought, actually I'm not surprised. So let me move away from this. I began a little heavy, and it's warm in here as well. This word, Indian, where does it come from? I'm going to use the word Indian a lot here. It's a sort of an unword. You're not allowed to say the word Indian these days. I feel like I can because I'm one. I've been rebuked for using the word Indian, and I said my response is, don't tell me how I refer to myself. People don't quite know what to do with that. The word Indian is necessary because we still have an Indian Act. It's a legal term. It's a political term. As long as the Indian Act exists and it defines and it has certain features, you can look it up on the government website. There is an Indian Act. So long as there is one, then it refers to something and the word must be used. Some people think it's a term of abuse. Let me just say a few words about that. In Jerome's Vulgate, India was Persia's easternmost province. Right here, Esther 8, verse 9. Provinces from India unto Ethiopia. We could find the same thing in the life of Alexander. He went all the way to India, it says. So as we know, when Christopher Columbus traveled west and thought he went so far west that he hit the east, he said, I've arrived at India. Well, that's the easternmost point, and because he knew the globe was circular, assumed that he'd hit the India. Of course. It's a mistake, of course, but he didn't know any better. It's not pejorative in any sense. Less known, by the way, is that India did not exist when the Baptist missionary William Carey landed in Bengal in 1793. India didn't exist. Persians and Greeks pronounced the river Sindhu, now in Pakistan, as Hindu or Indu. And it described the religious practices of the natives. By the way, the Hindus did not call themselves Hindus, they called themselves by the word sanatani, which is a Buddhist term. They had no word for their own religion. So what we get from this is that the Indians of India aren't Indians either. Nobody's an Indian, except it's a vague term of a geographical import, and it's an assumption that it's either the Far East, or in this case, we've come so far west that we hit the Far East, so everybody there is an Indian. And then we start distinguishing, here's the West Indies, there's the East Indies, and whatever. It's a term of confusion. Now I say this because, again, the term Indian is immediately perceived, at least in contemporary circles, academic circles, to be pejorative, and there is no such pejorative connotations with the word Indian, per se. Nonetheless, it is problematic because of the connotations we associate with India, the Indians, and the Indian Act. So let me put this up. This is from the Department of the Interior, its annual report, 1876. Our Indian legislation generally rests on the principle that the Aborigines are to be kept in a condition of tutelage and treated as wards or children of the state. The true interests of the Aborigines and of the state alike require that every effort should be made to aid the red man in lifting himself out of his condition of tutelage and dependence. And that is clearly our wisdom and our duty, through education and every other means, to prepare him for a higher civilization by encouraging him to assume the privileges and responsibilities of full citizenship. What does this term condition of tutelage mean? Immanuel Kant, in his little short treatise, What is Enlightenment, refers to the Enlightenment, explaining it as man's emergence from his self-incurred tutelage. By daring to know, sapere aude, is how he concludes that first paragraph in What is Enlightenment. He's going to dare to know, and he's not going to consult with authorities. He's not going to consult with the church, he's not going to consult the academy, he's not going to consult tradition, he will use his own rational mind. In other words, he will act autonomously. So the autonomy of the individual is an Enlightenment postulate. And Kant pushes it, and what we have here in this declaration I am suggesting is an Enlightenment view of the noble savage who has not yet attained autonomy. He doesn't think for himself. He uses traditions. He appeals to the traditions. He's not willing to use reason. If he were willing to use reason, then he would no longer be a ward of the state. But note that a ward of the state is an orphan. If you have no parents, you are a ward. You're put into an orphanage, and you're a ward of the state. By the way, Rousseau, whose idea of the noble savage, put all 5 of his children into orphanages. So what we have here, the idea of the noble savage, goes back all the way here, the Onondaga Madonna, is the need for these people who are in tutelage to the state or are wards of the state to be able to be autonomous, to act entirely independently. Now, this is not a Christian ideal. This is an Enlightenment ideal. It's one, however, which gets strongly expressed in the Romantic period, another area of expertise for me. And we note that the orphan is lauded in this period and onwards, and not before this. Normally, orphanage is a pitiable state. When you're an orphan, you have no one to look after you. You don't have parents, you don't have guardians, you need somebody to, because you can't do these things for yourself. And of course, an orphan is prey to the ills of the world. But for the Romantics and the Victorians, think Dickens and his heroes, they're invariably orphans. And you can go through a long list of 18th or 19th and 20th century texts that will show that almost every hero is an orphan. It gets to the point where it is no longer an incidental observation, it becomes a characteristic portrait of how we ought to be, because heroes in literature are role models for us. The question is, why would an orphan be a role model for anyone? And the answer is because an orphan is going to be Kant's thinking person. He's going to think for himself. He has no choice. He's going to dare to know. So again, in Dickens, you can find the same thing in Anne of Green Gables. He's an orphan. You can find the James Bond, Harry Potter, and you can go on and on and on. Orphans. All the superheroes. Marvel, they're orphans. And the power they find is within them. They dare to know, they dare to act, they have a daringness about them. The Indian is incapable of doing this, and so we have to bring them to the point where they have that daring to do this. And until such time, it is our duty to keep the savages under our care as our wards. Now, what's the relation of this to their families? Well, we're going to come to that. Because obviously, if we see them as orphans, as wards, something's going to happen to their families. And this is part of the iniquity of the residential schools. Now, let me say something about this. Oh, before I go to that, this man, Duncan Campbell Scott, became the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs 23 years after writing that poem. And he says, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not an Indian that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Now, that could sound rather malevolent. Let's annihilate all the Indians, but that's clearly not what he means. What he means is that they are no longer our wards, and they are acting as autonomous individuals, according to the Enlightenment model. What we're going to have to ask ourselves and think about is the Enlightenment model of human nature, of autonomy, compatible with the Christian view of human nature, of personhood? Is it the same? Is it different? It's clearly different. Is it compatible? That's the question. Is it reconcilable? Duncan Campbell Scott. What's the purpose of solving the Indian problem, or what's the solution to solving the Indian problem? Enfranchisement. Now, this is a term that we associate with slavery. To be enfranchised is to be freed from slavery. In this condition, in this situation, the slavery is not literal. It's slavery to their Indian customs and culture and parents. We're going to de-Indianize them by making them autonomous. The ultimate purpose of enfranchisement was to encourage assimilation, reduce the number of Indians the federal government had in tutelage, i.e. the number of wards that the state was financially responsible for. It's not only a financial consideration. There's a belief that to be a true human being, you have to be autonomous. And so we're helping them develop and make the progress of being a fully human being. Now, the purpose, there are different phases of the residential schools. Residential schools were, I think, largely started in French Canada, largely by Jesuits. The schools were voluntary. They were done as missions. They were outreach. Later on, they were in Upper Canada, where we are, Ontario. Other churches, Presbyterian, Anglican, Methodists, started residential schools, often at the request of native bands, because they wanted a better path for their children. They wanted employment. The old ways were not working. It was a voluntary process. There was obviously some encouragement, and as we can see from what we've read thus far, there was a different motive from the perspective of the state. From the perspective of the parents, their children would do better in life if they had a good education. So residential schools were invited, and initially they were voluntary. However, when the Canadian government took responsibility for this, they shifted from that phase to being involuntary, compulsory. The first operating residential school, by the way, is the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. My great-grandfather and his 12 siblings went there, and they were there against their will. They were compelled. And their mother, after the 12th was taken away, died. I don't know why, obviously. But all 12 of her children were taken away from her. And the reason they were taken away from her is because actually they were considered, according to Canadian law, wards of the state. They weren't her children, they were wards of the state. I mean, she gave birth to them, but her status was not particularly relevant to the case. Because again, they saw them as under the tutelage or wardship of the state. It's a legal relationship. And furthermore, an Indian, according to the Indian Act, was a male person of Indian blood reputed to belong to a particular band. It was applied to any child of such person and to any woman who is or was lawfully married to such a person. And so an Indian was no longer considered a ward if they graduated university, married a non-status person, if they were a woman. So if you were a woman and you were native and you married a white man, then you lost your native status. That's one way of putting it. And that's the way you usually hear it. You can put it in the reverse, however, and at that point they became a person, legally speaking. Before that, they were not. This was known as enfranchisement. This process of being denuded of your Indian status was called enfranchisement, liberation. Now, under Section 112 of the Indian Act, known as the compulsory enfranchisement section, which was not removed till 1961, it's not even listed on the website because the Act still exists. That's why it's there on the website. And it's been stricken because the parts that are stricken no longer apply. And so we can't read them. If you can find them in a historical document, but not on the current website, because it's not an archive, it's an operational legislation. So at issue here is, here's what I want to speak about, and here's where it gets a little hard for us. Because at issue here is the issue of personhood. The flip side of being wards of the state is that status Indians were not considered people according to Canadian laws. And they did not become people until the Indian Act was revised in 1951. In 1951, an Indian becomes a person who is pursuant to the Act, is registered as an Indian. That's the new definition. The old definition, where was that? Here. That's the older definition. Notice any male person. Oops. So Indians were not considered persons as far as Canadian law was concerned. For that matter, neither were women early on. The so-called Persons case in 1929, the British Privy Council ruled that women were persons under the law. Before they were not, believe it or not. They had the right to vote, the suffragette movement at the end of the First World War, but they actually were not, under the law, persons. And because of that, they are treated differently. They don't have status. They don't have standing. There are certain things that they are deprived as a result of that. Now, personhood, then, in their conception of it, now I'm not speaking as a Christian, I'm taking how it was used here. The Indians doesn't have personhood. The women didn't have personhood. Personhood is not considered to be something intrinsic to the human nature of the Indian, as a consequence of being made in Imago Dei. It was a benefit conferred to them. If you behave well, and if you act autonomously, you will become a person. Then you will have standing under the law. So it was a reward for actions. It was not something inherent to the dignity of a human being. So as Christians, I think we need to be particularly harsh with ourselves on this front. I don't think it's a Christian doctrine. I don't think it came from Christian sources. I think that Christians were not sufficiently critical to realize the problem with the doctrine of autonomy, and used it and became used by the state for, quite frankly, illicit and dehumanizing practices. The intentions might have been good. I'm not commenting on this particular teachers in the system. I suspect there were many good, especially that they were probably there before it was compulsory as well. So there's doubtless many good teachers in the system. There are also doubtless many bad teachers. The point is that the whole system was dehumanizing because the people in the system were not human. That's the problem. They're not persons. So the secular critics speak of the Indian Act as paternalistic. That was the critique. And so it was amended because of the sexism to include women as well. So it's just basically, an Indian is whoever we say an Indian is. So it's a definition of whatever we say an Indian is, that's what an Indian is here going forward. There is no definition of that. It's just pursuant to the Act is registered, that's what an Indian is. It's a terrible definition. But it's pretty fuzzy and fits well with post-colonialism, postmodernism for that matter. So calling it paternalistic is true, but insufficient. We can be far harsher than that. The more trenchant critique is that it confers it as a reward. You become a human being. You become a person when we give you our approval. Now this, to my mind, it sounds a lot like the logic of the abortion lobby. The child becomes a person at that point when the parents want the child. But before this is a non-person. So again, note how the church went along with this dehumanizing view of people who bear the image of God. This is the harshness of the critique towards Christians. Natasha knows me, I don't pull punches. I mentioned already that in my own family, my great-grandfather went to one of these schools. He didn't run away from the school, but his brothers did. They were not allowed to speak Mohawk, which they spoke at home. They're not allowed to do so, and they were punished accordingly if they did. They're not allowed off the property. It was residential. They were taken away from their parents, and they would not see them again until such time as they were allowed to leave. So they were literally wards of the state. They had no autonomy or freedom until they were regarded as having autonomy. Now, that's inherently abusive. It's not even talking about whether they were beaten or violated or whatever, molested in any way. It's fundamentally, intrinsically wrong. So let's get to this view. Personhood, what do we mean by personhood? I'll just stick with the classical definition. Boethius is a person as an individual substance of a rational nature. Might be able to do better, I don't think so, though. It's pretty good. Note here, however, and this is important, it's important for contemporary literary theories like postmodernism and postcolonialism, which are going to attribute identities to groups, and particularly the group that they call the other, whom they're trying to protect. Now, who are those people? Well, they're these people, they're the Indians. And who are the Indians? They're the people that we call Indians. And who are the people that we call Indians? Well, they're the people that have a status card, like I do. Do I look like I'm an Indian? Maybe. But I have blue eyes. I don't think I look particularly Indian, but I meet the definition somewhere in a bureaucratic checklist. I have the status of Indian, and so do my children. So I meet the definition of that. Creates all sorts of problems in some ways. It's sort of ironic. By declaring this, am I an unperson? Well, according to this, no longer so I guess I'm a person. So you just get benefits. It's only good in that sense, in a practical sense. But note in this definition that accidents, and you'll understand this because of my audience, I don't need to explain this, is the opposite of substance. It's an individual substance. And what we mean by this is that the accidents of human nature, skin color, nationality, etc., are irrelevant to the definition. You are a human being if you are an individual with a rational nature, and human beings have that. And so note that individuality matters here. It doesn't matter to postmodernism. Individuality doesn't matter. It's the group it's the other, that group. What I'm going to contend here, and it's probably already clear, is that Christians were wrong in not defending persons. Their defenders, in speaking in the name of truth and reconciliation, aren't interested in the truth and have a very different notion of reconciliation. And they are also dehumanizing. Plague on both your houses. We have a rational nature because we bear the image of God, and God too has a rational nature. Come, let us reason together, saith the Lord. Where am I running to? Oh, Let me wrap up. I want to speak to a book that I just can't praise highly enough. If you want to read more about this, it's not about truth and reconciliation per se, but it's about the issue which I think is the most important issue before and after. It's what is a person. John Rist. Some of you, I don't know if you know Professor Rist. He was at University of Toronto for years. Terrific history of the concept of personhood from Plato, Aristotle, on to the contemporary. Various iterations. He argues that Boethius's definition is the sort of the classical, traditional one held for till the 14th century. And then it starts to give way to a different notion of personhood, which eventually gives way to the notion of an orphan, self-determining orphan. And here's what he says here. This is towards the end of his book. The secondary tradition, where they still talk about people, like think of Descartes. I think, therefore I am. He sounds like he's a rationalist. Actually, he's just defined human nature in accordance with thinking. But he doesn't have a body. He's got the mind-body problem, all sorts of, there are a whole litany of definitions of human nature that have no personhood. Descartes isn't a person, he's a thinking substance. That's not a person. The secondary tradition depends on a more general metaphysical claim, such as arguments against the very existence of God and for the replacement of the animating and determining substance called the soul by a self identified as consciousness and approximating more and more to an epiphenomenon of matter, hence modern materialism. We are basically biologically determined. It's a material entity. And it fits with the philosophy of organicism. I'm going to conclude with that. But in this changing environment, the older Christian concept of human dignity, based on the thesis that man was created in the image and likeness of God, has been replaced by a theory about human rights as of purely human origin and legal bestowal, so that in effect, and despite pretentious claims and denials, persons remain with neither dignity nor inalienable rights, unquote. That's Rist. I agree with Rist on this. I wish I could have written this book. When I read it, I thought I've been wanting to read this book my whole life. This is terrific. It really is very good. I can't commend it to you more highly. I'm still digesting it. It was related to my thesis, The Crisis of the Human Sciences, right? And the idea of human autonomy, the self-interpreting orphan, which I already talked about. In the 19th century, this becomes deeply problematic, and again, the idea of a self-interpreting orphan becomes the paradigm for human nature. The autonomy is the model of human nature. And the only way to preserve that is through group rights, etc. Let me conclude with this, or no, I'll conclude with that. That's good enough for now. We can always do Q&A afterwards. I've overshot my time. Thank you very much. So I believe there is time for Q&A. Yes?
So I have a question about the issue you're talking about person. Is there any more that you could say to explain that it was it an issue of difference about reality, or was it about argument about use of the term? Because nowadays we do have multiple notions of person. We have, say, an ontological one, and there's a legal one according to which corporations can be persons, but we recognize that these are not the same notion, or at least we could if we thought about it. So as it was used in these earlier documents, and you're suggesting that there should have been more pushback against it, was that really an issue about the reality of what our ontological person should refer to, or is it just a use of which was an issue about terms?
Well, I happen to think that the terms do matter. I recognize what you're saying, though, that it differs in a legal sphere. The legal sense is different than the theological sense, although one derives from the other. Personhood is not personhood is a new kid on the block, in a sense. You probably know this. In the sense the ancient world doesn't acknowledge personhood. There's an argument for it. per se, but it's not really considered to be definitive of human nature. They wouldn't talk about a person. Personhood arises from discussions of the Trinity, where it's relating to the three persons of the Trinity and how they relate to one another, and they relate as persons, and that's a lengthy discussion, but it's a relational term, and it defines the nature, and we bear the imago Dei, and therefore if God is triune in this personhood, we also are persons. It's just
So was there any issue then about whether these are human beings, leaving the issue of personhood aside? Was that ever?
well, it seems to be, but they're persons without legal standing, and they don't use the term person again. It's explicitly stated that a definition of an Indian, it's not a person. So I mean, it's very clear and sharp. It's a person is somebody who's not an Indian, or an Indian is not a person. It's quite extraordinary how starkly it's presented, and I think people are not sufficiently sharp on what is meant by that. Well, we generally know what you mean by that. You mean you want them to be more like the white man, so that they'll fit in and have a productive life and so forth. So that's what you want. Yes. So, and they're not. We're going to take responsibility for that. We're going to make them wards. We're going to give them food. We're going to create reservations. By the reservations are a creation of the Canadian government. I mean, a variety of ills are created by the government to deal with the Indian problem, but the biggest one is the problem of the Indians themselves. And again, they don't regard them as persons. It's extraordinary. If you read the older documents from the time of the age of discovery, or the time of discovery of the Americas, they speak of them as persons quite clearly. You have a duty to convert. You have a duty to treat them as bearers of the image of God. You are not to kill them. You're not to enslave them. There are declarations on that. It's very clear. Come this period, that language is gone. You're there to convert, but this agenda, that, as I marked it out here, is to get rid of the Indian through Enlightenment, and you're going to free them. It's not to make them. It's not even specifically Christian. Now, Christians may have been involved in the whole process and wanted to bring people to faith. I don't dispute that, but that's not the government's understanding. It doesn't want to do that. It wants to create an enlightened populace. And it regards those that are not enlightened as non-persons. So I think Christians were probably saying, well, we'll make the best of yes, this is clumsy bureaucratic languages, but we'll make the best of a bad situation. So it's hard to think back into the period, but I don't see any pushback. But I've not explored it sufficiently. I just note the legislation is there, and note the significance of being a non-person. Yes, sir.
In the situation right now,
Yes.
and I'm linking post-colonialism and Foucault's focus on power,
Yes.
would it be fair to say that there really isn't any real concern about what happened in the residential schools for their own sake, but rather that this is a way of using this issue from a post-colonial perspective to amass more power?
I think that's actually part of their presupposition. That's their explicit intent. It's to use issues to gain power. It's to use grievances to get power. So in a sense, the language of hyperbole, referring to it as genocide, is a means to an end.
Right.
They're not concerned whether it's a true designation. It's a powerful one. It has potency in the public. It creates images. We talked about unmarked graves and mass graves. Well, I immediately associate that with the Holocaust, right? And other places where they just throw bodies en masse into graves and they don't give them any dignity, private individual burials, none of that. My understanding, based on my colleague Ian Gentle's study, is there no bodies have been found.
No.
None. Still. And yet churches were burnt for it. And again, in our parliament last year, they were willing to use the word genocide, not even cultural genocide. In 2015, the word cultural genocide was used. Now it's explicit genocide. Cultural genocide, I would take issue with as well, because they weren't interested in cultural genocide per se. I think the personhood issue is the bigger issue. I mean, it's not that cultural is irrelevant, but the term genocide, I think, ought to be reserved for I think we need to be careful with inflammatory terms.
So the modern agitators really don't care about the personhood of the Indians and what happened to them and so on, other than as a means to an end.
I think that's the case for all the identity group politics. I think they're used as human shields for an agenda. That's my perception from speaking to the groups.
Well, I have to agree with you. But
Yeah, that's, yes.
So the infant in the womb is a non-person, according to this.
Yes, yes,
And that's what people feel justified in abortion.
correct. And the reason why it's a non-person is because the state hasn't declared that it's a person. It will attain personhood when somebody wants it, and that politically there's an act, but it doesn't matter what the facts of the situation are. That's irrelevant. This is an exercise in power at this point. It's an exercise in language, it's an exercise in law, but it's not an exercise in the truth of the situation.
The same thing with people with severe dementia who can't
Yes.
make their own decisions.
Yes,
They're not a First Native because they're not autonomous.
correct. Yes, the argument of autonomy is particularly potent. That's a justification for almost everything. So now it's being used in euthanasia for mental health now, as we know. Yes.
So I'd love to hear from you as far as, since in spite of all of these complex power relationships and so forth, since, as you were, of course, relating, there were real abuses that happened, what do you think Christians should be doing?
I was hoping someone would ask me
anything?
that.
Because I agree that issues are used by people in all kinds of ways, but we ought to care about the bad things that were done, right? And if there's some way to kind of make things better. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we've now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies we were reconciled to the Son by the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled shall we be saved by his life. This term reconciliation is a very important one, as I said, for Christian theology. It's very important. And there's a uniqueness to reconciliation here. I wanted to get to this, but I thought I don't have enough time to do this. I'll put it up on the screen behind me. There are different types of reconciliation you can contemplate. X persuades Y and Z to give up their mutual anger. So husband, wife, will you be reconciled to one another? That's a form of reconciliation. X persuades Y to give up Y's anger to, will you please stop being angry with me and be reconciled? So a third party can do it to others. You can do it directly to somebody. That's a form. X persuades Y to give up Y's anger against X in a passive sense. I'll just leave that and not explain. And then finally, although you want to Matthew 5:24, X gives up his own anger against Y. I just voluntarily. I have a grievance, but I'm going to choose to overlook it. And I am reconciled because I make the choice to be reconciled. All these are terms. But I don't think that Paul's use in this passage fits any of these. In this case, God removes the cause of his own anger against us, namely his sin, our sin. He removes our sin. He removes our sin from us. That's reconciliation. It's not he decides to forgive us, just like the case of 2. He removes the sin from us. He doesn't see it anymore. It's gone. That's reconciliation. Now, this is the grace of God, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's real reconciliation in a Christian sense. And this is what everyone, man, woman, child, Indian, non-Indian, all persons are granted the grace to receive. It's a free pardon. It's free grace by the blood of the Lamb shed for us. That's real reconciliation. That can be pointed to by everybody. Everybody who has been sinned against or who has sinned nonetheless can experience the grace of God in reconciliation with him. Now, with that reconciliation, knowing that we deserved his wrath and others deserve us, we can be at peace with them because we were sinners against God and he's at peace with us. So with that grace, we can show grace to others. So how should Christians respond? I think with this. In the same way, I happen to think that the people who started doing residential schools initially, offering them as an option, probably wanted to do so out of an act of charity. I suspect. I can't imagine any other motive. It was voluntary. The people behind them did that for that very same reason. I think that bearing anger against people destroys you, personally. I don't think it goes away. There's no way of correcting it through linguistic acts, through legal declarations for compensation payments that doesn't take it away, doesn't take away the enmity. Only grace does that. So I think that we should be reaching out and extending the grace of God as I think Christians, when they were acting as Christians, always did. I have no better answer. Yes.
What's the difference between a thinking substance and a rational substance?
A thinking substance, Descartes uses the term res cogitans. And it's literally a thinking thing, because a res is a thing, right? And he, where's Mr. Boethius? It's a substance, not a thing, first of all. And a substance has weight. It's the opposite of an accident, right? It's something that's intrinsic to it's a property, it's a quality. Like, whereas a thing, it's just, you're just a mind. And it's not even clear that there's a body, and your existence is dependent on your self-recognition, even. It's not by virtue of being made in the image of God, who's rational. It's that your thinking gives you, it's not even rational thought, it's thinking. I think, therefore I am. Actually, he says, I doubt, therefore I'm doubting, and if I'm doubting, I'm thinking, and if I'm thinking, therefore I am. There's a whole chain of consequences. He doubts the whole world, except the fact that he's doubting, which means he's thinking, and if he's thinking, he says he exists. Later writers will say, he doesn't prove that he exists even, he just proves that he's thinking. That's all he proves, but there's no existence demonstrated there. It's an unnecessary conclusion. So again, it sounds similar because it's the rational nature, but again, every word there has import. It's not the best answer, but yes.
Thank you, that was excellent. I learned a lot
Thank you.
from your talk, and food for thought. So get your thought, two things about, one is I was reminded of the eugenic policies of Canada.
Yes.
That went
Same
along
period.
the same timeline,
Yes, they did.
and also went along with the denial of the human person.
Yes,
and
they
making
did.
people less than persons because of their IQ, which was an arbitrary thing invented by Piaget and all others. And many of the cultures couldn't take the IQ test because they didn't think that way. It wasn't intelligence, it was silly. And the second thing is, to Dr. Oliver's question, about the unhinging of the notion of personhood legally and morally. They used to be the same thing.
They did.
And
Now they parted ways.
The unhinging of the law from moral foundation.
That's postmodernism, really.
Yeah.
Even in jurisprudence, they're no longer bound by stare decisis, case law. They can depart from it. There's a form of jurisprudence called the living tree, in which they can repudiate decisions that they themselves made, and so it's against the whole common law tradition. But back to the eugenics point, it is absolutely the context for the period where the residential schools become compulsory, and experiments are undertaken, the Duplessis Orphans and various others. But Tommy Douglas, the founder of our modern healthcare system, did, I believe, a master's thesis on eugenics. Very much the spirit of the age. Eugenics and abortion go together. I think they are, the one is the fruit of the other. It's the defining of human nature by us and the perfecting of human nature by our own standards of what human nature ought to be. It's not taking it as it is. It's not taking it as a gift, as a product of bearing the image of God. It's something that we control. Autonomously, we define, we can change, and as I said, I don't know what the slide is. It parts ways, and it creates confusion, and in the confusion, power reigns. And so again, this is a great place to give this talk. The need for people to think clearly and articulate themselves in public is greater than ever. It's always been, but more so than ever. I wanted to call Michael O'Brien forward. I spoke before because Michael has a unique experience for people here, and he was in a residential school, and he wanted to share just for a minute. If you would you? Please.
First of all, I personally want to thank you very, very much. I learned a great deal myself from your insights. You gave us really the architecture of centuries of problems and the construct with which to analyze it in terms of socio-political problems now facing us. But you also brought us back to the core issue, which moved me so much, because what is at stake in this whole question, one of many social questions facing us in these times, is the ultimate value of the human person. I remember my own 3 years as a resident prisoner of a residential school in the north. I was surrounded by a great deal of goodness among my fellow students and many of the staff, but among the staff there were sexual abusers. And among my close friends there were 5 guys who were sexually abused, and thereafter led consistently very disordered lives. One took his own life. These were good, normal guys. But they fell into the trap. They were controlled, radically controlled, as we all were, and they were dehumanized. Our particular abuser was a violent man. Most abusers are not violent. They tend to be subtle, clever strategists. They seduce subtly. In my residential school in Inuvik, over 25 years, there were 3 such abusers, all of them laymen, all of them brought to trial eventually after doing horrendous damage to hundreds of students. Okay, these are the obvious crimes. But when I went to the Truth and Reconciliation Conference in Inuvik, one of 7 held across the country, that the Commission held, in Inuvik, I was brought there by the Commission to give my story. The lone white man and the token white man. So I went north, flying there, hadn't been back to Inuvik for 15 years, this place of intense suffering for me, unceasing suffering and madness. I expected, grief heaped upon grief, that the whole event would be heavily politicized, heavily saturated in New Age solutions to the problem of man, radical anti-Catholicism. Well, I was, and Anglicanism and Methodism, etc., anti-Christian to the max. On the opening night ceremonies, the native leaders of several of the northern peoples, Inuit, Dene, others. Each of those leaders came up and invoked in their opening prayers the name of Jesus in their own languages. It was utterly stunning. And I think the bureaucrats from Ottawa were a little stunned too. So as I got to mingle with old schoolmates, now all of us old men and old women, stories started to emerge. I told my story. I was not sexually abused, but had to fight it off. And then, as a result of resisting our supervisor sexually, for the rest of the year, the next 10 months, I suffered violence, a lot of violence, physical and certainly consistently daily mental emotional violence. Some of the men, or these old men who had once been boys, just yesterday, were just boys. They came up to me afterwards and said, "Thank you for telling your story. I've never spoken to anyone about it." So I encouraged them to go and speak to the bishops of the North. 5 bishops were there, wanting to hear stories, wanting to hear what happened to them, wanting to ask pardon. And some of them did. They came back and told me later. Some of them did. This is a roundabout way of coming back to the central point I'd like to make, and that is to say, you are bang on the mark about personhood. Because beneath the abuse, beneath the violence, the loss of freedoms, the endless mockery, and for some of us, sexual violation, was a sense, a profound sense of depersonalization. We all felt worthless. And for years, it took me many years to get over those 3 short years, that experience, and much grace, and moving very deeply into life in Christ and the sacraments. All of this was a long healing process. But the hardest of all to deal with wasn't the physical blows. It was the sense of abandonment and depersonalization. You are an object. You do not have status as a human being. All of this is de facto written in the heart and the soul of a child. They don't have the rational capacity to counter these lies being written in their flesh and in their minds and their hearts. This can take a lifetime, and those sins that were committed against them, systemic sins, personal sins, they can be handed down generation one to generation. And what I saw in the North during my time there 50 years later was that there are numerous initiatives among the First Nations people, among the Native peoples of the North, Christian peoples of the North, to have prayer and healing sessions with people, ongoing counseling, not secular psychology, but a Christian psychology that takes into account the whole person, the whole truth about man, the whole person. So I see many signs of hope there. The other 6 TNR sessions across the country, I'm not sure what happened there. But in other talks I've given, I've met a man from Balakuda peoples, a man from the Anishinaabe, Northern Ontario. 3 of us spoke in a big public forum in Ottawa. Each of us told the same story. Each of us felt depersonalized. Each of us felt for many, many years we were worthless. These 2 men, not myself, but these 2 men, both had attempted suicide and were rescued at the last moment. One by an apparition of Our Lady. The other by the unexpected and totally surprised visit of a young priest who had, in prayer, been compelled, get up, go and visit so-and-so. And he talked to him, stayed with him, heard his story. And so began that man's conversion and the process of healing. Both of these men, including myself, all 3 of us, we said, Healing begins with absolute forgiveness. Forgiveness is the key to everything. If we do not forgive, if we give in to rage is social justice, venting, malice, distortion of the truth in order to achieve some kind of fugitive justice, then evil has won a double victory. All of us said the same thing in our different modes. Both men said, love is the way forward. Love has been my healing. Forgiveness has been open the gates to love. I think that's where reconciliation is going. It's not going to be throwing more money at people. I think it has to be, again, one by one, person by person. We love where we're at. Anyway, I'm venting here. Sorry.